Hey, gang. So today we're going to talk about what imperialism was like. And we're going to focus on two things today. We're going to talk about how the Europeans ruled their colonies. And then the second thing we're going to talk about is I'm going to give you an example of one way that Europeans really maltreated or mistreated their colonists. Okay. So, first of all, what was imperialism like for the colonies? Well, there were several different ways that Europeans governed or ruled the colonies. So, the first type is, like we've talked about, is just a colony. A colony is a country or territory that is ruled by another country. And there are two different ways that Europeans ruled their colonies. Okay, and this can, there were two different ways that Europeans ruled their colonies. One was through something called direct rule. Under direct rule, Europeans actually sent their people in to govern the day-to-day actions within the country. So it was Europeans coming from Europe, going into Africa or into Asia, or as we saw with the Spanish, going into Latin America and governing the day-to-day operations of the country. The structures of government were based identical to those in Europe, and it functioned just like a new version of Europe. Now, some examples of this are France governed their colonies that way, Spain, as we talked about in Latin America, and Germany governed Angola in Africa directly. So they sent European officials to govern them directly. Now, why would European countries did this? They did this because of what's called a sense of paternalism. Paternalism is the idea that you want to be a father to someone that you don't think can handle things on their own. And that was the idea, was that Europeans didn't think Africans were capable of governing a country. They thought it was just too complicated. Another goal of this was, one, they said Africans couldn't do it because they weren't smart enough, basically. And the other goal was to ultimately assimilate or pull in the colony into operation and into working with the European mother country, almost like being a state. And for a while, northern Africa, Algeria, was basically a state or department of France. Another way the colonies were ruled was through indirect rule. Indirect rule still involved a high level of European control, but now, instead of Europeans governing the internal structure and day-to-day operations, local government officials did. Now, they still had to operate and do what the Europeans wanted them to, but this was very much under the guidance of Europeans, but they were still allowed to govern themselves. So in the South Pacific, in the Philippines, which was at this point an American colony, the Philippines were governed through indirect rule. The Americans allowed locals to rule, but they had guidance from America. Britain ruled most of her colonies through indirect rule. When the United States was a colony of Britain, that's how they ruled. India was ruled indirectly. Australia was actually allowed a lot of independent rule or self-rule, but the British allowed India in particular and some of her African colonies to be ruled indirectly. The reason they did this was to hopefully develop future leaders within the colonies so the colony could govern itself and still contribute quite a good deal to the British economy or the American economy. Okay, another example of colonial rule is called a protectorate. A protectorate is basically a colony in which the locals govern their own internal functionings, okay? But the mother country, Britain in this example, because Britain governed Nigeria, the British governed the external international affairs. So within the country itself, the Nigerians or people living in the Niger River Delta were in complete control. But in their relationship with other countries, the British controlled all of that. Okay, so that's what a protectorate is. Basically, the mother country is protecting the child. The child can make choices on their own as long as it just involves them. But when they have to interact with other people, the mother country steps in and protects them. Okay, another example of colonial rule is simply called a sphere of influence. Now, a sphere of influence, it has the least amount of control over the colony, okay? It's not really a colony. A sphere of influence is simply where a mother country or developed country like the United States or many of the European countries would have a special trading relationship with another country, and they would have great influence. And basically, the African or Asian country would only be able to trade with that European country. Some examples of spheres of influence where the Europeans or Americans had an impact over decisions they made were in Liberia. The United States had a special relationship with Liberia, and Americans and the British and the French and even the Germans and the Japanese, which we'll talk about tomorrow, all had a special relationship with areas in China, and those were spheres of influence within China. So those are a couple different ways that colonies will rule. So you see there that we went from the highest level of control to the lowest level of control. So lots of control in direct control colonies, then a little bit less in indirect control colonies, and then spheres of influence have the least amount of control over the country and their actions. It's more like an economic partnership more than anything else. Well, what was it like within the colonies? Well, life under colonial rule could be very hard, and the best example to illustrate the difficulties of this is by talking about a guy named King Leopold of Belgium. The colonists, the natives, particularly in Africa, more so than in India, were treated very harshly. Again, I said earlier that under direct control, the French, for example, did not believe that the Africans could govern themselves. They just didn't think that they were simply capable of it. And so what they did is they said, well, we're going to do things for you. Well, there's one guy, King Leopold of Belgium, took control over the area that we now know as the Congo in 1884. So at the Berlin Conference of 1884, which Otto von Bismarck set up, again, that's another reason why he's my favorite guy. In 1884, the Berlin Conference set up said, all right, King Leopold, you get this area in Congo. It was called the Congo Free State, and this land is going to be Leopold's personal possession. So he owns it outright. The whole idea of this was that he was supposed to help improve the lives of Africans. Well, that is exactly not what he did. He, in fact, made their lives much more difficult and much harsher. And here's what he did. In the Congo, they had a lot of rubber trees, and they also had some other raw materials. And since that was one of the main reasons that Europeans went into Africa was to get raw materials, he extracted a lot of rubber from the Africans. And for Leopold, he basically had this private army that worked for him. And if the Africans were not producing the amount of rubber that he wanted, he would actually have them mutilated. Oh, you didn't get the rubber that I wanted? Well, I'm going to cut off your hands. And there are several pictures, not on here, I don't have them, of Africans with their hands cut off because they did not produce or were not producing enough rubber for Leopold. He wanted to make a profit. He treated the Congo, and it was his personal possession, the land that he owned. Well, and that also created a lot of conflict between the tribes internally in Africa and in the Congo, and that led to a lot of the issues that we still see today with tribes internally fighting with each other. Those of you that had me in geography will remember me talking about that a little bit as well. So Leopold treated them very badly. His maltreatment ended in 1908 when he was basically forced by Europeans to give up control of the Congo to his country, and Belgium took control at that point. Today, it's now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but there's still a lot of internal strife left over from King Leopold's maltreatment. More tomorrow, and how the natives responded to European domination. Bye-bye.